Mrs. May has gone on record. She's written a book, and some of it's published today in the Sunday Times. That's where you put books these days because nobody actually buys them. And she's criticised implicitly Boris Johnson for shattering trust in MPs. Well, the trust in MPs, I think, was shattered by Mrs. May. Mrs. May is the person who loved bureaucracy so much. She reduced everything to paperwork and to the back burner. She put everything into the long grass, lots of metaphors here. And she invented the hostile environment, the thing that is dogging our days and will dog this particular Conservative administration to its conclusion and its very miserable end. It will be a screaming whelp that may not actually reach maturity again in our lifetime, I predict. And that is Mrs. May's fault. It's not Boris Johnson's fault. Boris Johnson was always evident. He was the bag of ready-made marzipan that could be seen glowing on the shelf with additives, and additives of his own making, of course. We knew exactly what Boris Johnson was. Boris Johnson didn't change from the point when he joined the Bullingdon to the point when he put his key in the door of number 10. No, Boris Johnson was always the same, completely predictable. Ken Clarke was perfectly right to warn us off Boris Johnson, but Boris Johnson was a charismatic leader. Just his charisma was the wrong sort of charisma for the age, for the country, for ourselves. I mean, he would have been better off running North Korea. But his was not the axe that has felled the Conservative tree. No. His was the icing on the cake, the marzipan on the cake. And Mrs. May was the person who personally spooned out the flour, did the stirring, did the baking, supervised the agar, and made that cake. The cake that we are eating today was made in the Home Office, and the Home Office ministers who have followed her have followed in her type, just as the culture ministers who have followed Nadine Dorries have followed in her type. There is a particular type, and the mood is set, and it's very difficult to change that. Dominic Raab set the tone at the Foreign Office. That tone hasn't really lifted even under James Cleverly, who's a significantly more capable individual. In fact, Dominic Raab has a lot of potential, wasted because he spent his time relaxing on a beach in Crete, slapping on number 10. But Theresa May is quite right. Boris Johnson brought the reputation of British politics to a new low, but he also had the charisma to reach out and walk on the world stage and attract attention, and his instinct with respect to Zelensky was absolutely right, and he had the language and the words to be quite an interesting statesman on the world stage. The point was he didn't have the discipline to actually do the job, and he couldn't keep his pants on. No, he was chaotic, but entirely predictable. Mrs. May was the one who did the damage, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this over the next year, because the MPs in the current House of Commons are going to be lining up to defend their reputation, knowing full well that this could be the end. This particular group of MPs in the Conservative Party, in government at the moment, could well have contributed to the death of their party. And they want to distance themselves from that flagging heartbeat. And that's where Mrs. May's book comes in, and we've got to the point where the DUP were being positive. She was dependent on them. Of course, they're being positive. And then she blames Bercow. Oh, anybody but herself. Mrs. May was a disaster. The only thing she managed to do right, I think, was steer steer herself out of that field of wheat. That has been her only success. And also castigating Boris Johnson from behind. But who wants a backseat driver? Really, when she was given the wheel, she was useless.